You know that experience in poker when you do everything right and still lose a bunch of money? Now, sometimes it's because your opponent just got lucky and you got the money in good and there's nothing really quote unquote to worry about. But other times it's because you are actually following a book strategy that is not the right strategy for the given environment that you are in. And the really insidious thing about this is that solvers tend to confirm that the play that you're making is correct. And so you keep on making the play over and over, bleeding money over time and not knowing where and why you're losing. So in this video, I'm going to cover 5 spots where GTO is absolutely the problem and not the solution, and what you should play instead. Stay tuned as we break down these 5 spots. By the way, if you like poker and PTO poker content, be sure to subscribe to the channel. About 90% of you watching these videos are not subscribed, and it really does help out the channel if you jump in there and click that subscribe button. Okay, so back to spots where GTO burns money, and coming in at number 5, we have rigid 3-bet or fold ranges. So these are really like the bread and butter for like the rigid online poker players, the people that really adhere to the ranges and the charts and are more just thinking about like the theory of the situation as opposed to the people game. And the problem with 3-bet or fold, we come across it in a couple spots. First off, let me just give 3-bet or fold its due. Like, let's say the button is opening and you're in the small blind and we're playing 100 big blind poker. For many people, 3-bet or fold in this spot will be an upgrade over what their current strategy is, which involves way too much flat calling. A lot of people are flat calling not only with marginal hands that like can get away with flat calling here, but a lot of hands that are just not strong enough. Things like Queen 10 offsuit, Queen Jack offsuit, they're flat calling in this configuration. These hands are subject to domination. They also risk getting squeezed by the big blind. Even if the big blind doesn't squeeze but just call, they perform very poorly in this configuration out of position against 2 people. So hands like, that type of hand, the offsuit broadways, the offsuit aces, the suited trash, all of this needs to just be folding. And so it would seem on the surface like 3-bet or fold at least forces a player's hand into doing that and showing that little amount of discipline. However, I would argue that we can do better than 3-bet or fold. We should be considering the player, not just where in the chart our hand shows up. And the reason I'm saying this is there are 2 different configurations that are really important to know. One of these is where a professional player opens from the button and you have a recreational player in the big blind. So here, why on earth would you play 3-bet or fold, isolating the pro with a bunch of marginal hands in your range when these hands would be much more profitable as calls and allowing in the player in the big blind who will likely make way more mistakes? The pro will also 4-bet way more often than the typical player, so a lot of these hands are going to have 3-bet and then fold, which is a big loss, and they're just going to perform a lot better with this other player that's prone to making mistakes in the hand. The other thing is if you're playing a 3-bet or fold game against a pro, it's forcing you to fold hands that would be profitable as calls. So things like deuces through sixes, for example, some of the suited aces here, these hands could potentially call, allow in the player in the big blind who's going to be calling with all sorts of suited trash. Now your suited aces can actually cooler this player for huge pots if you do make a flush, and if you happen to hit a set with your low pocket pairs, players like this will not fold top pair nearly often enough, and you can win a big pot. Compare that to, isolating against the pro. They're just not going to have those same implied odds, and very often you're going to get 4-bet off your hand pre-flop. So in this configuration, I'd highly advocate for having a flatting range when it's the pro opening the button and you have the player in the big blind that's not as good, and you can balance your range by calling with some pretty strong hands that actually should be 3-bets in theory. So things like, maybe 9s or 10s, maybe an ace-queen offsuit, these types of hands you can call so that in the event that the player in the big blind folds, your head's up against the pro, but you have some board coverage, you have some strong hands that can call down, and you're not just like, an open book with like deuces through sixes and a few suited aces that can easily be exploited. You actually have some strong hands that are there for balance. These hands can also, again, still win a big pot in the event that the big blind comes in. Now flip it around. Let's say that the really bad player opens from the button, you're in the small blind, and the pro is in the big blind. Now 3-bet or fold makes a ton of sense because you can isolate the bad player, especially if you're deep and the player is prone to making post-flop mistakes. So now you can actually put in some of those hands that were previously just folding according to GTO. You can put them in a 3-betting range at some frequency. You can put like the low pocket pairs back in. You can put more suited aces back in. You can just isolate this player, not allow the pro to come in without having to cold 4-bet, and you'll often fare better here. So this is where not considering the player and taking too much of a chart approach is really the downside to this rigid 3-better fold. It also comes up again in squeeze spots. So GTO really pushes for a squeeze anytime there's an early position open and 2 calls, okay? So if you're on the button, let's say hypothetically you have a hand like ace-8 suited, or you have a hand like pocket 5s, and a tight pro opens from early position, and 2 callers come in the middle from recreational players that are playing way too many hands, why on earth would you play a 3-better fold strategy here as a squeeze with these hands? These hands are immensely profitable as calls from in position, and you're risking very little. You stand to win big pots with implied odds. It's just by far the best play in live poker. If you're playing a 3-better fold approach from here, you're forced to fold these hands because you can't be 3-betting a range that includes them. Otherwise, you're 3-betting way too wide. If you're 3-betting all the pocket pairs, all the suited aces, now you're very vulnerable to 4-bets again, which is not where we want to be, and it's not where the money's coming from by 3-betting and trying to squeeze off against this pro that can easily play back at us. It'd be much better to just be mindful of where the money is coming in the hand and not play GTO in this spot with this sort of rigid, 3-better fold squeezing strategy. So coming in at number 4, we have the multi-way sandwich. And this is a very common spot in live poker and online poker too, where basically you open, a player flat calls you from in position, and then another player calls from in the blinds. So basically you are sandwiched in between one player that you have position on and one player that has position on you. And the way the theory of this is supposed to go is that you do a lot of checking in this spot, because the player that has position on you is supposed to have flatted with a very strong range, especially if they flatted from, like, say, the cutoff or the hijack, and they're risking, getting squeezed by many people behind them. They have to call with a very tight range in theory. Well, guess what? This is not happening in live poker. In live poker, players are flatting with these bloated ranges that really cannot stand the heat from squeezes. They really shouldn't be playing hands like, offsuit aces, offsuit Broadway hands, suited gapper, suited trash, when they're not, like, even on the button, a lot of these hands are marginal, but even before the button, we see these hands represented in live poker. So if you're on a position, you're playing against the appropriately tight ranges, you do have to do a decent amount of checking, because you don't necessarily have the range advantage against the tighter range, and you're up against 2 people, and, at 200 big blinds, say hypothetically, we're pretty deep, and position's going to matter quite a bit. But in live poker, again, when we've been flattered by really the range of bullshit that has so much, complete garbage, we get to go back to c-betting again. And it's going to play a lot better in a lot of scenarios, because the second thing is, when you're checking your range, theoretically you are checking a lot of your value hands, because check raising is going to be more valuable. But in live poker, the other problem is a lot of players that are flatting with these bloated ranges, they're also fairly passive. So when they're checked to, they may not put in the bet, which allows you to check raise. So now all of a sudden your value hands are losing that street of value when you could have just kept the initiative and started building a pot right away. The other thing to consider is that sometimes by checking, you find yourself in really tricky lines when the action goes bet raise, which happens more than you think. Even the passive players sometimes stab. Often the check raise comes in from the big blinds, and now a lot of your one pair hands, even the strongest one pair hands, are in complete no man's land. And it's a great play, really, from the check raiser to be doing this if they feel as though they can put you in this type of bind, and maybe the player that's stabbing isn't overly strong given their starting range. So what to do instead? It's important to think about the tendencies of the player that is in position. Okay, so this player, if he's super passive, like we said, you should just keep the initiative, bet your hand, steer out of these lines where the action gets checked through on the flop, or worse, where the action goes bet raise. Now, if the player is really aggressive in position, now you can play closer to equilibrium. Now you can go back to having a pretty aggressive check raising strategy. You can even consider range checking if he's being very, very aggressive. So again, the theory in this line is that the player might be stabbing pretty aggressively from in position. The player that's in the blinds has to be pretty careful because you are checking with an uncapped range from out of position. He's got to worry about both you and the stabber. And this enables you to, just give up on a lot of your air that doesn't want to just bet blindly into two people from out of position, but have an aggressive check raising strategy with some blocker based hands, some good draws, and with your value hands that want to start building that pot. Now it makes more sense because the action's actually getting bet. But if that's not really happening, I would prefer just leading out and not letting passive players be their passive selves. So coming in at number 3, we have 4-bet bluffing ranges. So GTO Wizard and solvers will always mix these in to give some balance to your value hands pre-flop. And these are valuable in the right situations. But against a lot of recreational players, these are very unnecessary and they actually bleed a lot of money. So the thing to realize, hypothetically, if we look at live poker 3-betting ranges from recreational players, they are often tighter than they're supposed to be at equilibrium by quite a bit. They're often strong ranges. And, if you take an example, like the hijack opens, the cutoff 3-bets, and it comes back to the hijack. The cutoff, in theory, is supposed to be 3-betting a range of around 11% of hands. So let's look at this. So the range is 11% of hands. And again, I'd urge you to think about, is this looser or tighter than the typical live poker player? I think it's very clearly a bit looser. And because live poker ranges, when you face this 3-bet, they're going to be stronger than this. We're not going to bluff back at them nearly as often. It's just not necessary. We're not going to have the same fold equity, which is where the profitability of these bluffs is really coming from. So we're just hitting a brick wall way too often with our bluffs, bluffing into a range that's too strong and is just not folding. So it's true that a hand like ace-4 suited or ace-5 suited does have decent equity against big pairs, is a good hand to crack a hand like, say kings or queens, but that's as a backup plan. We don't want to be unnecessarily shoveling in money with 30% equity, fighting uphill into a range of big pairs that isn't folding, right? Like the real profitability was coming from the pre-flop fold equity, and as a backup plan, we have the 30% equity. So just think about your opponent's range, how tight it is, how likely it is you're going to get that fold when you play back at them with a 4-bet. Against loose aggressive players, against pros, against people that are actually playing close to equilibrium, that's when we reintroduce these suited ace, these suited king bluffs out of respect for what they're playing, and now we can play back at them closer to equilibrium. But against a player that's really playing an, they don't even realize they're doing this, but they're playing an exploitatively value-heavy game against us for a 3-bet, that means that we're not going to face this 3-bet too often. And so we can fold more often when it comes. It's not a big deal, and we don't have to bluff uphill with these weak hands against them. All right, so if you enjoyed these 3 ways that GTO is burning money for you, the last 2 ways and the most important 2 ways are actually in the PTO Poker membership. We are offering a free trial. You can check it out. It's brand new this month. Go to pto-poker.com/membership. It's a great combination of private coaching, digital content, and a group community that can really help you up your game. Be sure to check it out, and hope you enjoyed the content and hope to see you again here soon.